A beloved teacher's secret double life with two students spirals into a deadly showdown, shattering a small town. What led to betrayal, murder, and the unraveling of lives in this twisted true crime case? November 15th, 2007, Greenwood, Ohio. Thomas was a high school teacher known for his charm and dedication to his students. But tonight he wasn't grading papers. He was staring at a photograph of two young women, Emily Carter and Rachel Davis, his students. His fingers trembled as he traced their faces. The secrets he had fought to bury were starting to surface, and he knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Thomas's relationship with Emily and Rachel had begun as mentorship. Both were bright, talented, and drawn to his charisma, but over the months, lines were crossed. He had promised them attention, whispered assurances that made them feel special. For a while, he managed to keep his double life hidden, maintaining a facade of normalcy. But secrets like these have a way of festering, and his world was beginning to crack. November 20th, 2007, Greenwood High School, 3 p.m. The tension was palpable. Emily and Rachel, once close friends, now barely spoke. Their rivalry had grown bitter and dangerous, fueled by jealousy and betrayal. Whispers spread through the hallways, rumors of stolen glances, hidden meetings, and furious arguments. Thomas tried to manage the situation, but every attempt only pulled him deeper into a web he couldn't control. The girls were slipping away from him, and he knew it. That afternoon, Emily cornered him in an empty classroom. Her eyes were red from crying. "You said it was just me," she said, her voice raw with pain. Thomas tried to calm her, but she pushed him away. "You lied!" she spat before storming out. Fear settled in his gut. If Emily exposed their relationship, everything he had built would come crashing down. November 22nd, 2007, Greenwood Park, 10 p.m. The air was cold, and leaves crunched underfoot as Thomas walked to a secluded area of the park. He had received an anonymous note, "We need to talk, come alone." He knew it was dangerous, but he couldn't ignore it. When he arrived, he found Rachel waiting for him. Her expression was a mix of anger and desperation. "You've ruined everything," she said, her voice trembling. "Did you think you could play us forever?" Their confrontation grew heated, words turning sharp and cruel. Rachel revealed she knew about his meetings with Emily. She threatened to go to the police, to the school board, to anyone who would listen. Panic surged through Thomas. His career, his life, it would all be over. He begged her to stay quiet, but she was resolute. "It's too late," she said, turning to leave. Desperation clawed at him. "Rachel, wait," he pleaded, reaching out. But she pulled away. In that moment, something inside him snapped. He grabbed her arm harder than he intended. She struggled, fear flashing in her eyes. "Let go!" she screamed. In the scuffle, she fell, her head striking a rock. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking the earth. Thomas stared in horror, his mind racing. What had he done? He checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. Rachel was dead. November 23rd, 2007, Thomas's home, 2 a.m. Back at his house, Thomas's hands shook as he scrubbed at invisible stains. He couldn't sleep. Images of Rachel's lifeless body haunted him. He had panicked, hiding her in the woods, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Sooner or later, someone would find her. Emily's face flashed in his mind. She would come looking for answers, and when she did, everything would unravel. November 23rd, 2007. Thomas's home, 8 a.m. Morning light crept through the blinds, but Thomas hadn't slept. Every sound outside made him flinch. Convinced the police would burst through the door at any moment, he tried to calm himself, reminding himself that no one knew what had happened. Yet. But his mind was a storm, and he couldn't shake the image of Rachel's blood pooling around her head. His phone rang, startling him. It was Emily. "We need to talk," she said, her voice strained. "Meet me at the old library, now." Thomas's heart pounded. He knew he couldn't refuse. Emily was already suspicious, and if she pushed too hard, the fragile control he had left would shatter. November 23rd, 2007. Greenwood's old library, 9:30 a.m. The library was abandoned, its shelves collecting dust and memories. Thomas arrived to find Emily pacing, her eyes wild. "Where's Rachel?" she demanded. "She's not answering my calls." Her voice cracked. "What did you do, Thomas?" He tried to stay calm, to lie his way out, but Emily saw through him. "Don't lie to me," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I know something happened." She stepped closer, her fists clenched. "You promised me it would just be us. Was she in the way? Did you hurt her?" Panic surged through Thomas. Emily's accusations were hitting too close to the truth. "It's not what you think," he said, but the words felt empty. She backed away, shaking her head. "You're a monster." In that moment, Thomas knew he had lost all control. If Emily went to the authorities, it would all be over. He had to stop her from talking. But before he could move, Emily ran for the door. He chased after her, his mind racing with desperate thoughts. November 24th, 2007, Forest Edge, 1 a.m. Thomas tracked Emily to a secluded spot near the edge of the forest. He tried to reason with her, to plead for her silence, but she was beyond reason. "You killed her," Emily said, her voice hollow. "I won't let you get away with it." She turned to leave, but Thomas grabbed her arm. Their struggle was violent and frantic. Emily fought back with everything she had, clawing and screaming. But Thomas was stronger. He pinned her against a tree, his mind a blur of fear and rage. "You can't tell anyone," he said, his voice shaking, but she spat at him, defiant even in her terror. In a moment of desperation, he covered her mouth to stifle her screams. The struggle continued until suddenly her body went limp. Thomas stepped back, horrified at what he had done. Emily lay motionless on the forest floor, her eyes staring into nothingness. He collapsed to his knees, consumed by guilt and fear. November 24th, 2007. Thomas's home, 5 a.m. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. 2 lives lost because of his lies, his betrayal. He knew there was no turning back. All he could do now was cover his tracks and hope that no one would connect the dots. He buried Emily near the spot where Rachel lay, a makeshift grave hidden deep in the woods. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't stay buried forever. November 25th, 2007, Greenwood Police Department, 9 a.m. The disappearances of Rachel and Emily sent shockwaves through the town. Their families were frantic, and the community demanded answers. Police launched a search, but there were no leads. Thomas tried to maintain his composure, attending vigils and offering his support. But every moment was torture. Every glance felt like an accusation. The pressure mounted when a detective named Laura Bennett took a special interest in the case. She was relentless, sharp-eyed, and driven by a personal connection. She had known Rachel since childhood. "Someone knows what happened," she told the press, "and we will find the truth." Thomas's world was crumbling. Laura's determination was a threat he couldn't ignore. But as much as he tried to stay ahead, the walls were closing in. November 26th, 2007, Greenwood High School, 8 a.m. The hallways of Greenwood High buzzed with whispers and rumors. 2 students missing, Emily Carter and Rachel Davis. Their faces were on every notice board, and students walked in hushed groups, their eyes darting nervously. Thomas walked among them, trying to appear composed, but every step felt like a march toward his doom. He felt their eyes on him, imagined their whispers. Guilt and paranoia gnawed at him like a relentless disease. Detective Laura Bennett had made her presence felt, questioning teachers and students. When it was Thomas's turn, she fixed him with a cold stare. "Mr. Reed," she said, her tone deceptively polite. "You were close to Emily and Rachel, weren't you?" Thomas forced himself to nod. "I mentored them. They were promising students." He kept his voice steady, but his palms were clammy. Laura didn't blink. "Did you notice anything unusual before they disappeared?" "Nothing," Thomas lied, fighting to keep his expression neutral. Laura's eyes narrowed, and he knew she wasn't convinced. November 27th, 2007, Greenwood Police Department, 10 p.m. Laura pored over case files, determined to find a break. She traced Emily and Rachel's last known movements, digging into their relationships, their activities. A pattern began to emerge, a connection that led back to Thomas Reed. She couldn't ignore it. "He knows more than he's letting on," she murmured to herself. The next morning, she confronted the school principal, demanding access to Thomas's files. There was nothing incriminating on paper, but it confirmed what she already knew. Thomas had spent more time with Emily and Rachel than any teacher should. It was enough to heighten her suspicions. November 29th, 2007, Thomas's home, 7 p.m. Thomas sat in his dimly lit living room, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made him jump. He knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, hoping to numb the guilt. But it only made the memories sharper. As he stared into the bottom of his glass, the phone rang. It was a blocked number. "I know what you did," a distorted voice said before the line went dead. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Someone knew. November 30th, 2007, Greenwood Forest, 11 p.m. Driven by paranoia, Thomas returned to the shallow graves. He needed to make sure there were no traces left, nothing that could tie him to the crime. As he approached the site, he noticed something was wrong. The ground had been disturbed. Panic surged through him. Someone had been there. A rustling in the trees made him spin around, but there was no one in sight. The darkness pressed in around him, suffocating. He realized he was being watched, hunted even. Whoever it was, they wanted him to know they were closing in. Detective Laura Bennett called a meeting. "We have new evidence," she announced, her eyes glinting with determination. "Anonymous tips, sightings, even traces of disturbed ground in the forest. This case is about to break wide open." Thomas heard about it through whispers at school. His heart sank. He had to do something, anything, to stop the truth from coming out. That night he packed a bag, ready to run. But before he could leave, there was a knock at his door. Laura stood on the porch, her expression cold and unyielding. "Mind if I come in?" Thomas's pulse quickened as he stepped aside to let Detective Laura Bennett in. The air felt heavy, and the room seemed smaller with her presence. Laura's eyes scanned every corner, every detail, as if committing it to memory. "This won't take long," she said, her voice calm but laced with intensity. "I have some follow-up questions." Thomas forced a smile. "Of course, anything to help." She sat across from him, placing a small notepad on the table. "You were close to Emily Carter and Rachel Davis," she began, her eyes never leaving his. "Everyone says you were their mentor. You must have known them well." Thomas nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Yes, they were promising students. I tried to guide them." Laura leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "You must have noticed any changes in their behavior, something that might explain why they disappeared." Thomas swallowed hard. "I already told you. Nothing seemed unusual." There was a brief silence. Then Laura dropped the pretense. "Let's cut the act, Mr. Reed. There's evidence that both girls were last seen in your company, and we've received interesting tips about your behavior." Her words hung in the air like a threat. Thomas's mind raced. "Tips? From who?" he asked, his voice betraying his nerves. Laura didn't answer. Instead, she stood, her eyes cold. "I'll be in touch," she said, heading for the door. "Don't go anywhere." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Thomas in a suffocating silence. He knew he was running out of time. December 2nd, 2007, Greenwood High School, 9 a.m. Whispers followed Thomas through the hallways. Students and staff avoided his gaze, and every interaction felt like a trap. He felt the walls closing in. During his lunch break, he received another call from the anonymous voice. "You can't hide forever," it said, then hung up. Thomas's hands shook as he clutched the phone. That night, he searched through every possible connection, anyone who could be behind the calls, anyone who might know the truth. He found nothing. The pressure was becoming unbearable. He knew he couldn't keep this up. If he didn't act, his secret would destroy him. December 3rd, 2007, Greenwood Police Department, 7 p.m. Laura was relentless. She and her team followed every lead, combing through records and interviewing anyone connected to the case. She sensed she was close to something big, but it remained just out of reach. Frustration gnawed at her, but she refused to give up. That night, she received an envelope slipped under her office door. Inside was a single photograph of Thomas in the forest, near the spot where the ground had been disturbed. No note, no explanation, just damning evidence. Her heart pounded. This was the break she needed. December 4th, 2007, Thomas's home, 3 a.m. Thomas jolted awake, sweat soaking his sheets. A noise outside. He crept to the window and peered out. Nothing but darkness. He turned away, but a figure moved in the shadows. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, heart hammering. "Who's there?" he called. Silence. Then a voice from the darkness. "You can't bury the past." The flashlight flickered. Panic surged. He swung the light around, but the figure was gone. He retreated inside, bolting the door. His paranoia was eating him alive, and he knew it. He needed to find out who was tormenting him before it was too late. December 5th, 2007, Greenwood Forest, 10 p.m. Desperation drove Thomas back to the forest. He needed to see the graves, to know if they had been disturbed again. He moved quickly, his breath visible in the cold night air. But when he reached the spot, he stopped dead. The graves were empty. Dirt had been dug up, and there was no sign of Emily or Rachel's bodies. He stumbled back, horror clawing at his chest. This wasn't possible. Someone had taken them. The sound of footsteps made him spin around. Detective Laura Bennett stood there, flashlight in hand, flanked by officers. "It's over, Thomas," she said, her voice steely. "We know everything." Thomas's world tilted. He turned to run, but hands grabbed him, pulling him to the ground. He thrashed, screaming, but it was useless. His lies, his crimes, they had finally caught up with him. December 5th, 2007, Greenwood Forest, 10:15 p.m. Thomas struggled as officers restrained him, their grips unyielding. The forest that had once been his hiding place now felt like a prison. Detective Laura Bennett stood over him, her flashlight casting harsh light across his pale, sweat-soaked face. "You thought you could keep this buried?" she asked, her voice cold. "It's over." Thomas's mind raced. How had it come to this? He had spent weeks evading suspicion, covering his tracks, and yet here he was, caught. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice shaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Save it for the confession," Laura replied, signaling the officers. "Get him out of here." December 5th, 2007, Greenwood Police Station, 11 p.m. Thomas sat in a cold metal chair, his wrists cuffed to the table. The interrogation room was sterile and silent, broken only by the hum of the overhead lights. Laura entered, a file in hand. She dropped it on the table, its contents spilling out, photos of the disturbed graves, witness statements, and the anonymous tips. "We have you, Thomas," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "The evidence is overwhelming. You can either tell us everything or this gets worse for you." Thomas's eyes flicked to the photos. then back to Laura. He knew there was no way out. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice hollow. "I tried to keep it under control." "Control?" Laura's voice was sharp. "You manipulated those girls. You destroyed lives. And for what? Your own sick gratification." Thomas looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "They were going to ruin me," he whispered. "I had no choice." December 6th, 2007, Greenwood Courthouse, 9 a.m. News of Thomas's arrest spread like wildfire. The town of Greenwood was in shock. Parents, students, and teachers gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice. The once respected teacher was now the face of betrayal and horror. Inside, Thomas's arraignment was brief. The judge denied bail, citing the severity of his crimes. As he was led away, the crowd erupted in anger. People who once knew him now shouted his name with contempt. He kept his head down, the weight of their hatred pressing down on him. December 7th, 2007, jail cell, 3 a.m. Thomas couldn't sleep. The walls of his cell closed in around him. He replayed every moment in his mind. The lies, the manipulation, the killings. He knew he deserved to be here, but he also knew he couldn't stay. His paranoia told him someone still out there wanted him silenced. The anonymous calls, the threats, they hadn't been from the police. Someone else was pulling strings. December 10th, 2007, jail transport, 6 p.m. The plan was simple. Thomas was to be moved to a more secure facility. But as the transport van sped down the dark highway, a black SUV appeared behind it. It rammed the van, sending it skidding off the road. The guards were knocked unconscious. Thomas, bloodied but alive, crawled out of the wreckage. The SUV's driver stepped out, face obscured by shadows. "Run," the figure said, tossing him a set of keys. "If you want to live." Thomas didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed the keys and stumbled into the woods. Whoever this was, they had just given him a chance. One last chance to escape the nightmare he had created. December 11th, 2007, abandoned cabin, 2 a.m. Thomas found shelter in an old cabin deep in the woods. His mind raced with questions. Who had helped him escape, and why? He knew he couldn't stay hidden forever, but for now he had no choice. He needed to find out who was behind this and what they wanted. But as dawn approached, headlights appeared in the distance. Panic surged through him. He grabbed the keys, ready to run again. But before he could move, the door burst open. The figure from the SUV stepped inside, gun drawn. "You thought you were free," the voice sneered. "You're not." December 11th, 2007, abandoned cabin, 2:15 a.m. Thomas's heart pounded as he faced the shadowed figure in the doorway. The cold metal of the gun glinted in the dim light. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice raw with fear and desperation. The figure stepped closer, revealing a familiar face, one he had hoped never to see again. It was David, Rachel's older brother. "Did you really think you'd get away with it?" David hissed, his eyes burning with rage. "You took everything from me, my sister, Emily, their lives." He raised the gun, his hands steady. "You're going to pay." Thomas tried to plead. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, his voice cracking. "I tried to stop it." "Save your lies," David spat. "You ruined their lives, manipulated them, and now you want to play the victim." December 11th, 2007, abandoned cabin, 2:30 a.m. The tension in the room was suffocating. Thomas knew he had only moments to act. "Killing me won't bring them back," he said, trying to reason with David. "You'll just end up like me, a murderer." David's grip tightened on the gun. "I don't care." Before he could pull the trigger, a noise outside made them both freeze. Flashlights cut through the darkness as law enforcement approached. David's eyes flickered with indecision. "They'll arrest you too," Thomas said, seizing the moment. "Run while you can." David's jaw clenched. "You're right," he whispered, lowering the gun. "But I'm not finished with you." He turned and disappeared into the woods just as the police burst through the door. "Freeze!" they shouted, guns drawn. Thomas raised his hands, his body trembling. He was back in custody, but the threat from David loomed large. December 12th, 2007, Greenwood Police Station, 10 a.m. Detective Laura Bennett was waiting when Thomas was brought in. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, her expression hard. "We intercepted your transport records being leaked. Someone wanted you dead." Thomas said nothing, but he knew she was right. Whoever had orchestrated his escape was playing a dangerous game, and he was the pawn. Laura leaned in closer. "You want protection? Tell me everything." Thomas hesitated. He could see only two paths ahead, cooperation or certain death. "Fine," he said finally, "but I need guarantees." December 15th, 2007, Greenwood Courthouse, 1 p.m. The trial of Thomas Reed became the trial of the decade, drawing national attention. Every sordid detail was laid bare: his manipulation of Emily and Rachel, their tragic deaths, and the cover-up that followed. Thomas, under intense questioning, revealed the pressures and fears that had driven him, but the jury saw through his attempts at justification. The verdict was swift: guilty on all counts, life in prison without parole. As Thomas was led away, he saw Rachel and Emily's families in the gallery. Their grief and anger were etched deep, and he knew he deserved every ounce of their hatred. December 20th, 2007, Highway 22, 8 p.m. During the transport to the maximum security facility, Thomas stared out the window, lost in thought. He had destroyed lives and ruined his own. There was no redemption, but fate had one final twist. A car sped toward the transport van, headlights blinding. It swerved, slamming into the vehicle. The impact was brutal. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and the world spun. When it came to a stop, Thomas lay motionless. The driver of the car, David, climbed out, his own body broken. "This is for them," he whispered before succumbing to his injuries. Thomas took one last breath, his life ending in the wreckage of his sins. The story was over, but the scars remained, an ugly reminder of how deceit and desperation could destroy everything. December 21st, 2007, Greenwood Memorial Hospital, 6 a.m. The air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and grief. News of the highway crash spread quickly. Thomas Reed and David, Rachel's brother, were both declared dead at the scene. The wreckage was a twisted monument to the pain and destruction that had engulfed the lives of so many. Detective Laura Bennett stood outside the hospital, watching the sunrise with a grim expression. The case was over, but there was no satisfaction in it. Lives had been ruined, families shattered. She had fought for justice, but the outcome felt hollow. There would be no trials, no confessions from Thomas. The truth was buried with him. December 22nd, 2007, Greenwood Town Hall, 2 p.m. The town gathered for a public memorial for Rachel Davis and Emily Carter. Flowers and candles surrounded their photos, and people wept openly. The community had been torn apart by the events of the past months, but in this moment of shared mourning, they sought a path forward. Parents spoke about the need to protect their children, and teachers promised to be more vigilant. Anna Carter, Emily's mother, stepped up to the microphone. Her voice trembled, but her words were strong. "We cannot change what happened," she said, "but we can remember. We can honor their lives by making sure no one else falls into darkness like this." December 23rd, 2007, Greenwood Police Station, 10 a.m. Laura reviewed the final reports on the case. The pieces had come together, but many questions lingered. Who had leaked Thomas's transport route? How deep did the network of people who wanted him silenced go? The people of Greenwood nodded in agreement, their faces determined. The darkness that had consumed their town would not define them. They would stand together, rebuild, and fight for the light. February 1st, 2008, Highway 22, 9 p.m. Laura drove along the highway, the cold wind whipping through the trees. She thought of Emily, Rachel, David, and even Thomas. Their stories were painful reminders of how fragile life could be. As she continued down the road, she vowed to keep fighting, not just for justice, but for hope, for redemption, and for the future of a town that refused to be broken.